Hey there, folks. So welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And here's one of the big ones. We're going to be talking about the newest album from Sun Kil Moon called Common as Light and Love Are Red Valleys of Blood. So I've got a bit of a complicated, one-sided relationship with Sun Kil Moon frontman Mark Kozelek, and not just because if we ever met in person, we'd probably hate each other with a passion, or at the very least find the other person utterly insufferable. Of course, all this would rely upon Mark Kozelek logging onto the internet or YouTube to find out who I am, and that's never gonna happen. His resentment of social media of any kind, that's near legendary at this point. But in this hypothetical, if you'd indulge me, should we ever meet, he'd probably brand me as an overly earnest, frequently annoying hipster poptimist that's still too damn pretentious for his own damn good. And at the same time, I'd probably brand him as a technophobic, raucous curmudgeon who is just as pretentious and whose underlying pathology of bitter nihilism is intolerable, shoddily justified, and really kind of inconsistent. And the hilarious thing is that, while we'd probably end up despising each other, buried deep down, we'd probably have at least some grudging acknowledgement of our similarities, of the other person's insight and intellect, and how our statements about each other probably ring more true than we'd prefer to admit to ourselves, at least not without some veneer of irony. And you know, that's the thing. For as much as I would probably despise Mark Kozelek in person, from an artistic standpoint, I find him a profoundly fascinating figure, and one where a lot of my frustrations are rooted in many of the parallels and flaws that I see in a lot of my own writing, in my short stories, and my novel. Self-aware framing, but never quite as deep as it could be to mine deeper insight. Poetic, detailed, ultimately deconstructionist in the themes, but never quite enough to mine it into a cohesive narrative, all against an instrumentation and tones that can be as inviting as they are really abrasive. Much of my complicated emotions culminated in my rather controversial review of Benji, his critically adored 2014 album, of which I admired a fair amount for a lot of the craft and the instrumentation, but thematically just frustrated me to no end. And while I was planning to cover his tangled and ultimately overlong 2015 album Universal Themes, to which I would argue hits a few underappreciated and stunning high points, it ended up just getting kind of lost in my shuffle. 2015 was a weird year for me. So in order to make up for that, I decided to cover his newest record, Common as Light and Love Are Red Valleys of Blood, a title that says more about him than any of my rambling for the past few minutes ever will, and it's Mammoth 2-hour plus runtime. In other words, I was gearing up for a monster of a double album. So how did that go? Well, I will say this. I've given this record on average about 6 or 7 listens, and I really worked to dig in as deeply as I possibly could into his writing and lyrics. I've given this album over 14 hours of my time over the past week or so, trying to untangle its knotted and yet scattershot ideas and rambling, because it sure as hell was a fascinating listen. And I think, finally, that I've got a handle on my thoughts about it and how to best contextualize what Sun Kil Moon put together. And yet, note, for as much as I say that I now understand it, I wouldn't quite say that I loved it. Ironically, for a lot of similar reasons that compromise my feelings on Benji. Again, it is a fascinating listen, but outside of certain bits and certain songs, it's not exactly a listen as a whole that I'm in a hurry to revisit. It's a good album, but I wouldn't quite say it's a great album as a whole. And here's the thing. This project has a surprising amount in common with Benji, especially when you dig into the subject matter and themes. And yes, we're going to be starting with a deep dive here, as it's easily the reason why anybody would listen to any Mark Kozelek or Sun Kil Moon album, especially that he's opted for much more of a spoken word style, that he started more on Universal Themes, where the instrumentation is intended to support his words rather than stand out more than ever before. Like most of Benji, the backdrop of this album is strewn with death, specifically between the period of January to mid-August of 2016. Although the stories told seem to play very, very loosely with any sort of chronological progression. And just like with Benji, it rapidly becomes apparent that Mark Kozelek, with rare exception, is using a lot of these deaths almost as a backdrop to his own intense awareness of his own place and time and his own mortality. But this time around, it feels a little different. For one, the deaths that Mark Kozelek mentions aren't just people that he and the audience seems to barely know except through his description, which led to an odd sense of detachment and distance to run through through the writing and delivery of Benji that never really clicked to me. No, despite there being a few callbacks to Benji, like with Richard Ramirez on the meandering hotel investigation on Stranger Than Paradise, the deaths here, they feel bigger, and they seem to leave Mark Kozelek a little bit more shaken, a little more on edge. Be they David Bowie on Philadelphia Cop and Muhammad Ali in Early June Blues, to a close friend named Butch who died on Butch Lullaby, where the details feel all the more vivid and intimate. But it's not just the names this time around either, it's the atmosphere, often conveyed through the bare bones bass lines and sharp percussion and kind of off-kilter melodies that comprise so much of this album's instrumentation. Death, it was a specter on Benji, but here it seems much more omnipresent, a heavy cloud over top, from the news broadcasts that peppered the album to the lingering feelings of tension, panic, and loss that came to epitomize so much of 2016 for so many people. And yet, throughout all this, Mark Kozelek, he continues to live, continues to breathe and skip movies and lose money on boxing matches and go for walks and increasingly cherish his relationships, both with his long-suffering girlfriend and his audience, and you can tell that even that realization that he's still alive kind of rattles him, especially considering his interest in strange, inexplicable deaths that hasn't gone away, like on the Twin Stories of the Highway song. And yet, he of all people is still alive, avoiding freak accidents, with his thoughts frequently drifting to being a year before 50 and feeling kind of overweight, not as healthy as he could be. And while I was critical of the lack of satisfying narrative conclusions on Benji, when going through this album, I'm not sure if it's the more sprawling yet intimate feeling of tension or my own acceptance of these sorts of narratives, but it seems to connect better here, and I think I finally know why. Now, for a brief sidebar, over the past year or so, I've been watching more than a few Richard Linklater movies, and one thing that he seemed to be very much conscious of is the notion of time. From his Before trilogy to Boyhood, you can tell that there is a focus on capturing distinct periods of what many would just consider ordinary lives. And I bring up Boyhood because Richard Linklater is choosing to capture specific moments in this kid's life growing up that might feel a little thematically diffuse, might not always connect, not always contributing to what one might think is the narrative of life. Most because, as much as we don't want to admit it, there is no defined narrative for life. Trends and tropes and patterns, to be sure, but we can't live by the set path, especially in confronting the existential crisis coming at its ending. And yet, by the act of telling the story, we are indeed capturing scenes as diffuse as they are. And coming back to this album and Mark Kozelek, when you combine his routines that now feel all the more entrenched with writing songs and touring, when you start to see death all around you and you ratchet up that tension, his now attention to mundane detail and the lived-in experience, it does pick up a little bit more weight and thematic cohesion, especially when placed in that tighter focus and that intense self-awareness about where he is right now. But here's the problem. Despite that length potentially deceiving you as to otherwise, Mark Kozelek is still choosing what stories he's telling. And there's a distinction between existential anxiety in the face of death and just fucking with your audience because he has you in the album for 2 hours. And like it or not, you're still dealing with Mark Kozelek himself, a sanctimonious, technophobic hypocrite who has some frustrating gaps in his self-awareness and insight. He's more than willing to play to the crowd and jump on a big soapbox about gun control or trans acceptance like on Lone Star and Bergen or Trondheim, but it cannot but feel a little bit self-serving when he then includes multiple letters from promoters and fans exclaiming how much his music changed their lives. Again, I don't doubt that any of these moments are true, but note that he's making the choice to include them on this album. He's trying to say something with that. Now, he's also making the choice to take broad swipes at music journalism, like on Philadelphia Cop, which is very much justified and kind of hilarious. Oversensitive audiences on window sash waits, still mostly justified. And the American public for embracing Donald Trump, just as he feeds into their stupid no-attention span culture and internet obsession on Lone Star, which I would agree with if there weren't 3 big facts standing in his way. 1, when the social media-obsessed millennials, they did vote, they voted for Clinton, so his correlation there doesn't exactly equal causation. 2, Mark Kozelek is more than willing to play to millennial entitlement when they actually buy tickets for his shows. And 3, the cynical blend of earnestness, ironic detachment, insecurity, and self-obsession, that was originally rooted in the boomer generation, and you would think that he'd recognize his meandering navel-gazing and commitment to overlook overlooked mundane detail in his art is not that far removed from your average Instagram or Twitter feed. Now granted, I'll give Mark Kozelek some credit for at least acknowledging his inability to connect on songs like 70s TV show theme song, but for an album as extended and overwritten as this one is, I have a really hard time justifying acknowledgement as enough here, especially when added revelations when he does hit them, almost by accident, they feel increasingly perfunctory, especially when even he admits that he's making up filler for the back half of this album. I appreciate the meta commentary, but you're making filler and wasting our time. That's the other frustrating thing. Many people have already harped on the length of this project, but I'm not averse to longer songs if and when they're telling an interesting story, or they flesh out the details, or they ultimately come together at some point. The spoken word piece on Chili Lemon Peanuts, it easily could have stood alone, minus the first half of the song. Window Sash Waits, it could have easily been cut in half, especially as it really feels more like it's just planting for the payoff on Stranger in Paradise. And while I get the intent behind vague rock song with the meta subtext, Mark Kozelek even admits at the end of the song that it's a conceptual failure for him. He can't write this sort of vague rock song. And this before we get to the extended letter on Sarah Lawrence College song that I would have cut out entirely. It's not really all that interesting. Now that's not saying that the length can't be justified. The detail of Butch Lullaby only highlights how much more the loss of this longtime backstage crew member resonates for both Kozelek and other musicians. The conceptual detachment and miscommunications works for most of the narrative of 70s TV show theme song. I really dug that. And hell, I even got most of the references. And the listless, sleepless night on Philadelphia Cop in the wake of David Bowie's passing definitely resonates, although part of that might be driven by my own lingering emotions there. If you've seen my review of Black Star, you know what I mean. Hell, is that the reason why I Love Portugal is my favorite song on this album? A brief moment of light in a sea of tumult where Mark Kozelek finds a moment of peace while on tour there that very much mimics my own trip to Portugal last year? I wouldn't say that, no. It might be more because of the instrumentation, of which I haven't really talked about much because, again, it's very much plays the backseat to the lyrics. But credit must be given where it's due, because for as stripped down as many of these instrumentals are, Mark Kozelek does put together some solid experimental pieces. The eerie, bassy synth loop that anchors Philadelphia Cop perfectly encapsulates the unease of the track and fits with the fragile overdubs, the buzzing, grinding tension of the highway song and Burgeon into Trondheim, the blurry, melancholic guitar behind Window Sash Waits, the organ that holds up against the great bass texture on Bastille Day that actually picks up some kind of blues rock muscle that I really liked, all the way to the saxophone that shows up on 70s TV show theme song, because of course it does. But again, I Love Portugal probably works most for me because of the main melody hits that really serene vibe so well, and the vocal harmonies are phenomenally well balanced. And yeah, a lot of this comes back to Mark Kozelek himself, because where I found his vocals so frustrating on Benji, especially with a lot of the production, he seems to not just have more of a command of his range to bring more visceral intensity. The project with Yezu last year probably helped there, but also not dabbling with frustrating off-kilter overdubs and instead sticking with harmonies that do wonders for giving a meandering record some recognizable hooks here. But then again, if there was an album that made me think that I need to go back and revisit Benji at length, it would probably be Common as Light and Love or Red Valleys of Blood. I would not call this a great listen again. Kozelek is still a frustrating presence to be with over the course of 2 hours, and there's a distinctive difference between focusing on minutia in order to deflect from existential dread and just wasting the audience's time, or engaging in the sort of hypocrisy where he really gave himself enough time on this record to write himself out of it and he chose not to. Now there are other gripes. I wish that some of the melodies evolved a little bit more throughout the course of these long songs. There are some tunes that could have been trimmed down a little bit, and it's very telling that Natalie Hemby did less on 3 minutes with Cairo, Illinois off of her most recent album Puxico than what Mark Kozelek tried to do on God Bless Ohio in 10 minutes. But overall, there are very few songwriters as detailed, witty, and who can stumble into insight quite like this guy, and I can respect that a lot. For me, very strong 7 out of 10 and a recommendation, providing, of course, you can handle all 2+ hours it. I can't promise that you will like this, but I definitely promise you remember it if you actually pay attention and choose to listen and dig in. And hey, if you're looking to capture diffuse moments in time, Mark Kozelek, he can do it incredibly well. I might not like him all that much as a person, but I think I understand him and I respect him. And I think to the both of us, that would probably matter more. So yeah, check this out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yes, I know this review went on long, but I had a lot to say. It was a 2-hour album. It was very wordy. And if you guys want to buy this record, the link is in the description below. I heartily recommend you get it. It is a fascinating listen. And if you guys want to actually, if you guys actually heard it and you guys want to vote on it, the poll's right there. Have fun. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process, the link to my Patreon is right there, where 3 times a week contributors get to vote, and once a week on Saturdays for the higher Patreon contributors, they get to add albums to my schedule. So if you're a new artist, that's a way to get in on it. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.